Hello, I'm Kim Warren, and this is the first in a series of short presentations explaining how we've been investigating the use of system dynamics to help with aid for trade. That's assistance to developing countries to help them develop their export trade activity. This has arisen from some pilot studies done for the UK's Department for International Development, which I'll explain shortly. So the outline of the whole presentation series is that first in this presentation we'll start explaining the project background and its purpose and set the scene really by laying out the fundamental architecture of how the trade system actually works so that we can look at the features of that system that enable trade to happen and actually make it difficult. In the second video in the series we'll look at how we can use this picture to organise the portfolio of the large number of trade improvement efforts that are being made not only by DFID but also by other aid contributors and project teams in those countries. And the second video will also explain how we can use that to set up a framework for planning, managing, monitoring and evaluating a whole programme of initiatives, because this is a big complicated set of activities that's going on here. To demonstrate how the method actually works, there is a pair of presentations. The first showing how a systems model for planning and controlling a specific intervention might work, and we've used the example of training customs officials. And a second demonstration video explains how you could use the approach for planning and controlling a particular set of interventions to help enhance trade at a single land border. And both of those examples come with working models. Finally, there's a short presentation explaining some of the issues that need to be thought about and tackled if this approach to understanding and managing and planning aid for trade is actually to be used in practice. So let's start with, in this video, by looking at the project background and what we mean by this architecture of the trade system. The background to this set of efforts is that it's intended to support DFID's upcoming Aid for Trade programme, and the purpose of this is to pilot the use of the strategy dynamics method, which is a particular flavour of system dynamics in this context, and we're doing it by using models of DFID trade-related interventions. So the pilot is intended to inform the 5-year programme of expenditure and efforts that DFID is intending to make between about 2014 and 2018. And it should be emphasised that the purpose of DFID's interventions is to focus on helping the poorest people. So we're more interested, for example, in helping small traders trade vegetables across borders or small-scale manufactured items rather than exporting large quantities of cement or minerals. DFID already has a pretty well developed existing framework for monitoring and evaluating the work that it does. It's very conscious that it needs to show that the money it's spending is delivering value. But the department recognises that that framework has limitations arising from the complicated system nature of trade itself. So the benefits that they're looking for are to help assess ways forward for the whole Aid for Trade programme and inform how that programme is appraised from an economic value for money point of view. And furthermore, not just to appraise that programme looking forward, but once the programme starts, actually support the ongoing management of the programme of interventions that they're trying to make. Just an aside, I should mention at this point that strategy dynamics is a specific application of this more general method called system dynamics to strategic issues. System dynamics has been around for 50 years and is widely used in all kinds of different environments. This particular style of applying the method is evidence-based and quantitative. And we do address the issue that in this particular setting and many developing economy settings, there are limitations to the availability of data that you might need. It's just important to explain this because there are other styles of approach to the use of system dynamics work, such as qualitative feedback mapping And this is not one of those approaches. As I say, this particular approach is evidence-based and quantitative. Let's start with the conceptual framework that DFID already uses for evaluating and monitoring what it does. And this is very similar to the kinds of frameworks used in quite a lot of public policy and voluntary organizations. So the framework starts by recognizing that we employ financial and human inputs to this effort and employ material resources as well. So for example, we spend money, we have project partners, and they buy materials and they build a land border crossing or a bridge or something of that kind. That construction of something is an example of a task that's undertaken to transform the inputs into the outputs. The outputs are the products or services that actually get created. So in this case, it is more roads or an actual border crossing. But what we actually want are desirable behavioural changes. So in this case, we would like people to start using those roads and border crossings to actually get across and start trading. That is our intended positive outcome in this case, but there can be unintended outcomes which we need to anticipate, and those need not always be positive. There can be negative outcomes that we need to be conscious of and work to avoid. Ultimately, though, we're looking for long-term widespread improvements, the big impacts, and in this case, it's reduction in poverty. This is just a partial list of some of the outputs that different initiatives by the various agencies are seeking to have. So for example, there are initiatives trying to improve the infrastructure, there are initiatives trying to provide more and better trade facilitation services to exporters. We want more private sector enterprises engaging in trade. As I say, this is just a partial list of some of the outputs being sought, and I've drawn this from this report by Sana Consulting. The outcomes being looked for here, though, are things like reduction in non-tariff barriers, like lists of banned products for trade, that kind of thing, better access to export markets, overall increase in regional trade, greater diversification of exports, a whole set of different outcomes being looked for. But the high-level impacts ultimately are increased and sustained growth in trade, reduced poverty, more employment, particularly for poor and excluded groups in these countries, and ultimately higher incomes for those groups. The difficulties that DFID itself recognises in this framework, however, are principally that it's actually quite difficult to understand the cause-effect relationships between the items on the left, the inputs, activities and outputs, and the things we want on the right, the outcomes and impacts. And that's genuinely difficult. Now, no one is being less than thoughtful or skillful about this. It's genuinely difficult because the trade system is a system and it's got various characteristics which make it quite tricky to understand these relationships from left to right. So in between those outputs and the outcomes and impacts we want, we've got this thing called the trade system that is the thing that needs to be improved if you are to get the outcomes and impacts that you want. So for example, one of the outputs might be improved access to border, which we might get by improving road networks. It is expected that this would make it easier to start trading if you're a small trader and you can get to the border. That will make trading easier. The result of this, we hope, the outcome will be that more people trade. The impact will be that that will reduce poverty. But that system has got a number of features that actually make life difficult. So the first thing to recognize is that critical factors accumulate over very long periods of time indeed. So if we were to start constructing better roads today, for example, it may be many years before a road network to a particular region's border crossings is actually complete and people can start using it. So you get big delays from the actions that you're taking to the results, and the consequences continue for many, many years. You know, that once that road network exists, it will continue to support trading activity for a very long time. There's interdependence in the system, which means that multiple things need to be right, not just single interventions. And those need to be right on multiple issues. So it's no good having roads bringing people to the border if when they get to the border crossing simply hasn't got the capacity to let them through, or if corrupt officials mean that people have to spend long periods of time waiting to cross. Those interdependencies give rise to feedback mechanisms. Changes accelerate both good and bad. So if people start trading across a border, other people see that that's possible and an attractive thing to do, and more people start doing that. So that's an example of a good acceleration of progress. More traders bring more traders. There can be bad reinforcing effects as well. However, there's a different kind of feedback altogether, which is that improvements that start happening end up stalling or actually backfiring. So if more people start moving to a border to trade across it, but the border capacity is very limited and queues build up, then those same people say, well, there actually isn't any point my trying to take my stuff across the border because I just have to sit on the side of the road for hours. And those people who started trading then decide it's a waste of time and actually stop. So that would stall your progress on that particular improvement. And the last difficulty is that we've got thresholds, and thresholds are very important features. Good changes, for example, may seem to do nothing at all until a tipping point is reached. If I think I can make $20 by going across the border and trading, it's kind of not worth my while to do so. If I think I'm going to make $30, it's not worth my while, or $40. If I think I'm going to make $50, then it is worth my while, and it's not just worthwhile for me, it's worthwhile for lots of people, and so lots of people start to trade when you reach the point at which that threshold is crossed. So that's an example of a threshold giving rise to a good outcome that you want. There are bad ones as well, where things actually get a little bit worse and a little bit worse and a little bit worse until suddenly everything starts falling apart. So these are the reasons why systems like export trading are actually complicated and difficult to plan and manage and make improvements to. Now, it turns out that system dynamics, the method behind what we're doing, was designed deliberately to deal explicitly and quantitatively with all of these mechanisms, not just for trade, not just for public policy, but for all kinds of human activity systems. So how does this feedback thing work? Well, here is that trade system again, and here is the increase in the number of people trading. Here is the visible trade opportunities arising from that activity. So we get more people starting to trade. There is example of the reinforcing feedback. But here is the example of this countervailing balancing feedback that can stall progress. So yes, you get more people trading, then you get the delays at the border, and that drives people away and actually reduces the number of people who start trading. So that's just a diagrammatic way of summarizing those feedback effects. How does system dynamics go about dealing with those issues? Well, our start point for all of this is that we start with time charts of performance on any of the items in the structure. So an output we might want is reduced delays at ports and borders. Here we've actually got delays at ports and borders increasing, which is undesirable. The outcome from this is that trade, which might otherwise be growing quite fast, is actually growing quite slowly. It's growing slowly in spite of the fact the delays are getting worse, because maybe more ports and borders are opening up, but we've still got this problem of delays. The result of this is that, yes, we are slowly making progress in reducing the degree of poverty in the country, but not as quickly as we'd like. So for outputs, outcomes, and impacts, there is a history. The situation could get worse. Those delays could continue getting longer. We could continue to have a slow progress in development of the volume of trade, and we could actually see no further progress in reducing poverty, or it could even get worse for various other reasons. What we want, of course, is we want things to get better, but those things will take time to fix. It will take time to drive down those delays at ports and borders. So it'll be some time before we see that real upswing in the volume of trade, and therefore we'll have to wait quite a long time to see observable reduction in poverty. These are our overall aims, but this is a complicated system. We've got to find a way of cracking this complexity, and a way to do this is to recognize that whilst we are trying to deal with trade as a whole, trading activity actually occurs through each individual border crossing and port. So if we are going to get the trade system to work, we've got to deal with three broad stages of improvement. The first is we have to make it possible for people to get to the border crossing or port through which they might export and get there with products or services that they can actually sell. So access is the first issue. Capacity is the second issue. Once you've got to the border or you've got to the port, you've got to be able to get across it or through it, and to do so with as little delay as possible. Delay, simply deters people and it increases costs. So capacity is the second category of issues we've got to crack. Then it's got to be profitable for people to do so. So there have to be enough customers and markets across the border or out through the port for people to sell into at worthwhile prices without excessive costs, so that they make enough money for it all to be worthwhile. So those are the three broad stages of improvement that we have to work through. So how does this trade system work, recognizing that we've got individual people making decisions to trade? At any point in time, there is a certain number, a certain quantity of active traders. We don't generally know exactly what that number is, but we can make estimates as to how many of those people, how many of those organizations actually exist near any particular border, near any particular port, for any particular type of product. And the symbols here simply mean that the box in the middle is a stock or a tank containing people who are active traders, and that tank is being added to by people flowing in from the left-hand side. If we do get active traders increasing to some small degree, those traders start making some income, and that will encourage other people to become traders. That increase in number of people trading results, we anticipate, in higher volume and value of trade, and that reduces poverty. So our first challenge is to make it possible for those people actually to get access to the borders or ports. The next category of improvements we need to make concerns capacity. So the way that works is that if you have more active traders trying to export, then you've got more people and more stuff arriving at borders, arriving at ports. And if the capacity of those border crossings and ports isn't adequate, then people can't get across, and you put a brake on that increase in the number of traders. So that's the capacity issue. Lastly, when it comes to profitability, the number of people trading and the degree of delays involved, amongst other things, affect whether people are able to make enough money or not, and whether they make money or not will affect the frequency with which they trade, and it will directly affect the income that people make from trading. So our efforts to improve profitability would result in more people trading more often with more stuff and making more money, and that would accelerate this growth in the number of traders and trading volume. I should just say, by the way, that in many of these situations where cross-border trade is actually quite difficult, there is very often a very substantial informal trade. At the extreme, informal trade basically means smuggling. If the formal system doesn't allow you access, capacity and profitability, then entrepreneurial people will seek other ways of doing it, and informal trade and smuggling are some of those ways. So what I'm going to do now is just explain exactly how we use that little structure in the middle and the relationships between these items to figure out what's going on over time. And this stock thing is known as a resource. It's a quantity of what's known as an accumulating stock. And the way to think of it is this, that if you were to find a way of knowing exactly what's going on, you might discover that at any particular point in time, 300,000 people across the country are exporting across all the different land borders in the country. What we want is we want that number to increase, so we might find out a month later that that number has gone up to 310,000, and that gives rise to the increase in trading volume and value. So that thing in the box is known as a resource or a stock, and that increases because people who were previously not trading decide to move into that stock. So that item on the left is a flow rate, and you can think of the circle on it as being a pump. So 25,000 people were pumped into that stock during that month. 25,000 people started to trade. So that flow rate says how fast is the stock increasing. But if 25,000 people started trading and we only ended up with an increase of 10,000, that must mean that on the other side, 15,000 people stopped trading per month. So that's another of these flow rates. And the causal arrow, the grey arrow in this case, simply means if we know item A, the number of traders here, then we can work out B, what the trading volume would be. So the principle is flow rates drive the resources and therefore how performance changes over time. So the flow rates in these diagrams are the items we need to control. We need to understand, manage and encourage the flow rate on the left, and we need to understand, manage and discourage the flow rate on the right. We've got no direct way of intervening on the number itself. It's the flow rates that we can influence. Now that accumulation and depletion process continues over time. It's not just this month that that's happening, it's previous months, and it will be all months into the future. So what we do is we put a time chart on the flow rates as well. So in the green case, we've got new people starting to trade faster on the left, and we've got a slowdown in the rate of people ceasing to trade, and that's why the stock of traders escalates really very sharply in the stock in the middle. And of course, if both of those flows stay pretty much as they were, then we end up with rather little progress, and you get the red lines rather than the green lines. So let's use that method and that approach to figure out how the core of the system actually works. So we want trading volume to grow, which means that the net increase in the number of traders on the left-hand side must be faster. So that item is the critical thing, a desired outcome. The net increase in traders per month is something that we ought to be tracking because that's the critical thing that we're trying to affect. So the question that follows is, why do people make that choice? And why do they make this other choice at the bottom as well, to trade more often or to trade greater quantities of materials? And this is where the access, capacity and profitability issues impact on the system. If we want to bring more people into active trading, then we want to give them access, and that might mean building more roads or opening more border posts. We want to increase the capacity to help them trade across the border once they get there. That might mean constructing more buildings, providing more equipment, employing more staff, doing more training, and that raises the capacity in terms of how many crossings per day can actually go through our land borders or our ports. And there are things to do with improving profitability. We may need to help people get access to finance, make sure that the customers and markets across the border are developed, and that will help people become more profitable and increase their trading frequency. Unfortunately, we're also working against an environment where there are negative factors that actually disable traders and trading. So it's all very well being able to get to the border crossing because there are roads and there are border posts to help you through once you get there. But if there is a set of banned products and you're not allowed to trade in your product, or if there are lots of checkpoints inside the country before you even get to the border, that will actually be a disabler to your access. The same applies with capacity. We've got buildings and staff adding to the capacity, but if there are too many agencies imposing rules on what you can do, or too many documents you've got to fill in, or corrupt officials who slow you down, then those take away from the capacity to get you across the border, slow you down, and that increases delays and makes life difficult. And on profitability, there are negative aspects as well. If duties are too high, or there are corrupt officials requiring bribes from you to allow you to trade, then that's going to reduce your profitability and discourage your trade. So for access, capacity and profitability, we have enablers and disablers, the disablers being the items with red labels there. So what we want to do then is both build the enablers and cut the disablers. So we're adding to the kilometres of roads and border posts, the number of buildings, staff and skills, and the access to finance and customers. and we want to cut the disablers by removing the banned products, removing the internal checkpoints, reducing the numbers of agencies, documents, and corrupt officials, and improving profitability by cutting back on corruption and reducing duties and tariffs. If all that works, then we don't just bring potential traders through into the system, we actually create new people who might be interested in trading. So farmers who would never have thought of trading before suddenly discover that they can. We increase the potential stock, and that drives the system's growth still further. A place we can start is by looking at some of the policies and measures that are already in place and seeing how they map onto these high-level features of the trade system. And one example of this is that the World Bank tracks a series of logistical performance indicators. For example, it tracks the effectiveness of the trade clearing system, and what that does is it's an aspect of capacity in this system. The World Bank tracks the adequacy of roads and infrastructure, so that falls in the access area. They look at whether traders have got access to competitively priced shipping, which is an important determinant of profitability for trading. They look at the quality of logistics services. That features in the access part of the structure. And the World Bank tracks the performance of consignment tracking and timeliness of shipping, which again affect the profitability of trade. These are high-level aggregate indicators, understandably, given the high-level overview that the World Bank has to take on these issues, but each reflects specific resources in our framework, both positive and negative. Some items are missing. There's nothing here about banned products, duties, or standards, for example, but then that's not surprising either, because this is tracking specifically the logistical performance indicators. It's not attempting to track everything about the trade system. So that presentation has provided some of the project background and purpose, and also explained the essence of the way in which we look at this architecture of the trade system to help us understand where enablers and disablers fit in this system. What we'll go on to in the next presentation is to see how we can use this structure to organize the portfolio of trade improvement efforts and provide a framework for planning, managing, monitoring, and evaluating a whole program of initiatives.